Wonderful, thank you all. I'm going to just read something very brief to introduce our guest. Louise Fishman, American abstract painter, was born in 1939 in Philadelphia. She studied at what was then called the Philadelphia Museum School of Art in 1956 and 7, briefly attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and received a Bachelor of Fine Arts and as well as a B.S. in in art education at the Tyler School of Art, Pennsylvania. Fishman finished her academic studies in 1965 with an MFA from the University of Illinois. Ms. Fishman is the recipient of many awards, among them several grants from the NEA, National Endowment of the Arts, a Guggenheim Fellowship in Painting, Adolph and Esther Gottlieb Foundation Award, and the CAPS grant. She was a fellow at MacDowell Colony and recently honored by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has worked for several public collections, to name a few. She has work in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Jewish Museum, the Carnegie Institute, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Fogg Museum, and the Hood Museum of Art. She has more than 40 solo exhibitions and participated in countless group shows. She was included in 3 Whitney Biennials in 1965, 74, and the final one at the Whitney Biennial in the New Space in 2014. She was honored in 2011 and in 2013 with 2 residencies at the Emily Harvest Foundation in
Harvey.
Oh, I'm sorry, Harvest. Yeah, okay, thanks. Early. Emily Harvey Foundation in Venice, Italy. The waters from the 2 residencies were the subject of a solo show at Frameless Gallery, Gallery UNESCO, London in 2014. Since 1998, the Chime & Reed Gallery has represented her. Her current show at the Neuberger Museum of Art, Purchase College in SUNY, was curated by Elena Posner, which of course is another ArtTable member, the chief curator. The exhibition is entitled Louise Fishman, a Retrospective, and it's, I understand, your first museum survey.
That's correct.
Right. And of course we are joined with her loving spouse, Ingrid Noboy.
There is another retrospective at ICA in Philadelphia.
Of course, yeah. I somehow it was missing. There was like the second show that I was supposed to know. I was like, okay. So the ICA, it's wonderful.
How long are those shows up for?
The Neuberger is up through the end of July.
July
So it's the end of
31st.
July, and the ICA is into August. I'm not sure.
14th.
That's great.
14th of August.
Well, so shall we begin? Can you? Wonderful.
So what I've done is make a selection from a 50-year career. It's actually a little longer than a 50-year career. And I'm going to start with a painting from 1967, which I did this painting when I returned from graduate school. I had gone to the Chicago Art Institute to see a show of abstract painting, and Al Held, who I had always paid attention to, these very, impasto, heavy brush marks all over the place. I got there and he was doing hard edge paintings. It was his first. They were the first hard edge paintings, and I looked at them. I thought, no, because my experience in graduate school was, and this was of course coming from New York, that through art magazines, there's no internet, that painting was dead, and you couldn't use your hand to make a mark. It had to be a hard edge. Minimalism was coming in, and so And I took it very seriously, even though my passion was for paint and the brush and Soutine and Rouault and Cézanne and so on. And I began to work with acrylic paint, which wasn't very good at the time. It's interesting to me. This slide was a photograph of the painting before it had been repaired. It was badly damaged. You can see on the right bottom corner, it was actually rotted away, and after many, many months of repair, sitting now at the Neuberger Museum in very splendid condition, thanks to Suzanne Ciano. And this is directly connected to a painting that I did at the University of Illinois, which I destroyed. It was very related, but this is a much richer painting, I think. Oh, the one. This painting was painted in 1971, and I haven't seen it stretched since I painted it in 1971. This was typical of what I was doing when I lived in Soho, when there were only 2 galleries in Soho. One of them was Paul Cooper, who was upstairs on Prince Street. And it's a pencil grid it's a stained grid painting. There was a roll of paintings that I had in my studio for many years, and I didn't have room in my studio to unroll it, so I had the gallery take it and unroll it. And what happened is Ingrid Schaffner picked it for one of the 5 paintings that she included in her retrospective. And so it was stretched, and I was stunned when I saw it. I remember John Chime sent me a text message while I was in the studio, and he said, then he had a photograph of it, and he said, "This is beautiful." And no one had ever seen it, including me, other than my memory of it. And so there are others on the roll. Okay, next.
Could you just say what size that was?
Oh, yeah, sorry. That is 65 by 78, and the previous painting was 65 by 49. There's one missing. Let me see if it's skipped. Yeah, here. Okay, so I became very involved in the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement in a very serious way. And unlike a lot of feminist artists, I was very devoted to the deep understanding of what our situation was as women and trying to make art and the lack of a public and so on. And I was in a women's group with Patsy Norvell, Jenny Snyder, Harmony Hammond, Sarah Draney, Elizabeth Weatherford, who is just recently retired. And what I decided to do was to stop painting entirely. And because I suddenly realized, as was so obvious, that all of my work came from male art, and I wanted to expunge it. I wanted to strip myself of those influences and see what was left. And so I started out by cutting up my grid paintings and weaving them and stitching them and learning crafts, excuse me, that were abhorrent to me before, to learn how to knit and sew. And I learned how to knot, which is not a woman's skill exactly. But, and then with this particular piece, I had, I guess you could say I had breakfast at the B&H Deli on 2nd Avenue with Eva Hess a couple of times. I was working at Cooper Union Museum of the Decorative Arts. It wasn't called that then, and she had had that job when she was a student at Cooper Union, and so she came to visit Edith Adams, who was the librarian. It was a fabulous library, and we got to know each other. And she had very long hair. I didn't know much about her. I didn't know her work at the time. And one day, I got a buzz cut as part of my involvement in, whoever I was, trying to find out who I was. And I had lunch with her, and she said, I want to cut my hair. And I just recently saw the Eva Hess movie, which is so heartbreaking and exquisite. And I realized there was that moment when she cut her hair, and that was when she was about to really get it, really get involved in that work and do the work that was so rich and important, and unfortunately such a brief period of time. I didn't know her work at that time, but when she died, and I found out she died, and I was stunned because I didn't know that she was sick even. There was a memorial show at the School of Visual Arts, and I saw her work for the first time, and I saw what she was doing, and I thought, this is my key to new work. I can do anything I want. And I went out to Canal Street, where I was living. I bought a big bucket of rubber, whatever it's called, latex, whatever. I bought all kinds of materials, and the work I did after that was like an homage to her. And this is made with latex. It's, it's rubber on paper. There's a pencil. It's the grid, and everyone talks about how important the grid is to me, which is essential to me. And so the grid follows through most of what I've done. And in this case, it's, like the previous painting, which was stained. This is really like another step toward, an internal step towards dealing with the grid and making paintings. So, my first Whitney Biennial was in 1974, Marcia Tucker, courtesy of Marcia Tucker. And after the show, I got in touch with this extraordinary rage that seemed like it came from, there was a lot of rage rolling around during those days for women, and not just women, but particularly for women that, through my connection. And I began to, it just surfaced, it just kept coming up, and I realized that I started thinking about how women have suffered in the history books, the non-entities, the fact that they weren't represented. My art history education didn't include one woman, not one. And I had a terrific art education, but that was not part of it. So I was in my studio trying to regroup and go on with my work, and I had such a rage that all I could do was put a piece of paper up and write, "Angry Louise," serious rage. And it was the first time I incorporated writing in my painting. I haven't really done it since. This is like an homage, excuse me for using the word again, but an homage to T. Grace Atkinson, who was one of the chief curators at the ICA, and a fabulous woman who was an extraordinary spokesperson for the women's movement. She was the most literate, the most intelligent, she put it all together. She understood what we were doing and who we were, and obviously came from her own experience, because she was, what was it? It was, who was the artist that she gave a retrospective to? At ICA.
Yeah.
I found out this later. There was it Clifford Still?
I think it was Clifford Still.
Might have been Clifford Still. And he was so angry that a woman was writing the essay. that he was like, I'm not doing it unless she's not. So she had to put up with this, which I didn't know until I started working with Ingrid Schaffner on this retrospective. So this is one of 30 paintings I made. The first one was Angry Louise. Then I went to each one of my women friends. Then I went to the stellar people in my life, Marilyn Monroe, Jill Johnston, T. Grace Atkinson, Paula Cooper, on and on. Paula was very, very important to me and still is. This is one of the things I got on Canal Street was a little 11.5-inch masonite circles that had two little holes, one at the bottom, one at the top, and I did a series of maybe 30, 35 paintings on these little circles. I was trying to work with things that just came into my hands. I had done, I think this is a little bit out of order, but this painting, I'll come back to this. No, this one. I started working with found pieces of wood and just using the found pieces. I was living at Canal in Mulberry, and Keith Saunier and Jackie Windsor were downstairs, and Joan Snyder was across the hall. It was it really was a dense community at that moment. And so there was all kinds of stuff on Canal Street, on Mulberry Street. In the studio, people were discarding stuff that they were using. And I made my first solo show in 1974 at Nancy Hoffman Gallery. 73 was when the Whitney Biennial was, because it was the next year. I made these paintings. They were very dark, made with wax. The initial ones were using just found objects, and then I began to cut with a jigsaw and actually draw. What I felt like I was doing was drawing on the outside and drawing in the inside. So this one I actually cut with a jigsaw, which I never knew how to use before, so I, of course, had to learn how to do that. This is a painting that is 30 by 17 from 1974. Okay, back to, let me get back here. So this is
What is the year on this piece?
This one here?
Mm-hmm.
This is 73, 1973. So the entire time I was working with these masonite circles, I did drawings, but they were traced from the circles. So I was only working with circles. Circles within squares, circles on rectangles, or circles by themselves. And this is called Something to Say to Sonia Delamay. And, oops. This also was traced from this, I mean, it's 11.5 inches in diameter, all those little circles. This was a painting that I made for my parents, my mother, a painter, and it was tongue-in-cheek, but there it is, Louise Edith Fishman, Jewish Star. I've already spoken about this, called Caryatid. Next, I finally came full-fledgedly back to the rectangle and making paintings. There was one step in between which I didn't include, which was I was doing these cut wood paintings and had a 2-month teaching job in Chicago at the Art Institute, and they were supposed to give me a studio so I could work. I had my jigsaw and all my paints, and I had an apartment. And so I had to rethink everything, and I began just working on paper with what I thought of as drawings for pieces that I was going to make when I got back. What actually happened is I gradually, when I got back, I continued working on that paper, and the drawings and the paint moved slower and slower, but to the edge. And I was again working on a rectangle, albeit a rectangle that was flat against the wall, not projected as it would be in a stretchers. In stretchers. This is called Ashkenazi from 78, 32 by 48 inches. It's part of many paintings that I've done that have to do with my life as a Jew. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. And I'm not sure, this is a very painterly painting. There's no medium whatsoever. It's knife and oil paint, that's it. And I think the Jewish Museum owns this painting. I think they do. I'm not positive, but I think they do. One thing I want to interject here is that my education as an artist had a lot to do with making sculpture. which I think has affected all of my work, either in the nature of the mark or how I've approached putting things together. When I was at Tyler, the first year I was at Tyler, there was the dean was Boris Bly. I don't know if you've ever heard this name. He was an apprentice to Rodin, and he brought a very academic sculpture department in a barn to Tyler, and I did a lot of sculpture, and I really wanted to be a sculptor. But it was a 1.5 hour trip there. I had jobs after school. There was no way on earth that I could, I didn't have a place to work at home. I worked in the basement on paintings, in my parents' house, but there was no way that I could continue. I did wood carving, some stone carving, and a lot of studies of the figure. One time we had a donkey. And lots and lots of drawing. This painting is called Grand Slam. It's 56 by 40. It's owned by the Met. I showed it at Baskerville Watson, which was my gallery until they folded. Loved that gallery. It was so interesting in a million ways. A Grand Slam. I pitched hardball as a young person, and would have probably, had there been an opportunity, ended up as a baseball player or a basketball player. But when I graduated from high school in 1956, there were no avenues for that, unless you wanted to be a gym teacher, which didn't appeal to me one bit. And the obvious thing was, in my blood, was painting. My aunt, Razel Kapustin, was a very important painter who studied in New York with Siqueiros. Very important person, very well known in Philadelphia. My father's sister and my mother, painter. So I didn't want to be a painter. I looked like my mother just stayed home and took care of us, and she did this thing. Of course, I was introduced to the whole world of art through her because she was at Barnes, studying at Barnes Foundation. I saw all the books, Cézanne, Matisse, Renoir, and on. And that had the Philadelphia Museum. I was profoundly affected by living in the house with her and visits with my aunt, who would lecture me about painting. She didn't like Jackson Pollock. She thought he was a rip-off of Siqueiros. Siqueiros used enamel quite a bit before Pollock did, and he's, blah, 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 blah. Kept my mouth shut because I wanted to be Franz Klein, and she would never have approved of that. So, I'm really sorry this is so washed out. This is a very important painting called Haggadah from 1988. It's 37 by 50, oil on linen. In 1988, I went to Eastern Europe on a trip with the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation with a friend of mine who was a collector and a painter and a survivor of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Valerie Firth was her name. And I went. She came to my studio one day, and we went to lunch afterward. And we were sitting at Frank's restaurant in the middle of the meat market, and she spread these pamphlets out. She said, "They have asked me for many years to go on one of these trips, but I have refused because I don't want my nightmares to come back. But this year I've decided to go. They will only go on these trips with a survivor, at least one survivor." There were several that were on the trip, and she showed me this, and I realized that, aside from the fact that I had done a lot of reading about the Holocaust, I grew up during the Second World War, I knew a lot, not that much as it turns out. And I said to her, "Would you like me to come with you She was going with her husband, who had lost his entire family in Auschwitz, and the two of them I thought would be a very fragile and fraught time for them. And I thought of myself as being like an aide, someone who could be there with them. Well, it turned out that I was completely wrecked. On the trip, I was ice cold the entire time I was there. I could never warm up. And I was stunned at how I felt and what I saw. And she did fine. She said, "I'm going back to Auschwitz with a mink coat and silk underwear, Louise." So when I was there, I instinctively took a handful of soil from a pond that I knew was next to one of the crematorium, and they had emptied the crematorium into this pond as they were fleeing because the Allies were coming. I didn't know the story, but I could see, it was very obvious. So I picked up a handful of soil, put it in a Kleenex box, and took it back with me, and was unable to paint for a long time. And a friend of mine, and I said, I'm going to plant a tree upstate. I'm going to take the soil and plant. And this friend of mine, Bertha Harris, was a very fine novelist, said to me, "Louise, everybody plants trees. Make art." And with help of friends, someone brought me a mortar and pestle. I got wax. I ground these ashes into the wax, and I added just a small amount to each one of these paintings that was in this group. And I had not planned to show the group, but Simon Watson came to visit me when I was living in upstate New York, and I showed him the paintings, and I said, "I'm not going to show these. They just really are for me." And he said, "Nonsense. You have a responsibility. You have to show them. This is your responsibility. This is what you did. Now you have to show them." So he had a gallery which was very political at the time, Simon Watson Gallery.
Yeah, definitely.
And it was during the AIDS crisis, the really intense part of the AIDS crisis. And he was showing very interesting art that was political. And he showed this group of paintings with black and white photographs that I took when I was in Auschwitz, and did a beautiful little catalog. And in order to have the paintings out, I had to name them. And I try to name all of my paintings. It's like giving them a handle, safety valve or something for the world, for them in the world. And I decided that since Passover had been celebrated in the camps, and since it was a festival of freedom, that I would use, at each painting would be given a title that had to do with Passover. So that's what happened. This painting is called Haggadah. They're very somber. They're sanded. I added this material, but I kept sanding and staining paint into paint. And what happened is that it was really a symbolic addition of the soil. But as I painted, I was scumbling dry paint onto the surface, so it expanded the feeling and the importance of that soil. It's a painting, one of a group of paintings that I did, very large paintings with paint rollers. There's no knife, there's no brush. They're oil paint on linen, and they were a group of paintings that were involved with returning to the grid in a much bigger way than I had in recent past. This is 90 by 62, painted in 1992. And all the titles had to do with the planet Mars. It was something that was in the newspaper, and they all appealed to me so much. So this was Valles Marineris, which is apparently a system of what used to be waterways on Mars. The missing piece. This painting, which is called Iron Sharpens Iron from 1993, is 110 by 70. I showed it at Robert Miller Gallery. And I'll tell you, I didn't really get a sense of that painting from the time that it was originally shown, but it's at the Neuberger Museum, and when I saw that painting, I flipped. I thought, wow, I am a great painter. It is so powerful. I mean, it's a sort of hard, I mean, it's for me a very large painting, and it's built. I mean, it's very sculptural, it's very architectural, and it has such power to it. It really is impressive, you know. You saw it. Okay.
Maybe this is the painting where you came closest to Franz Klein.
Yeah, it could have been.
Or John Walker.
Not so much John. more Franz Klein.
Okay.
These are drawings that, there are several drawings in the show. This is the only one I'm using in this slide talk. It's 36 by 25, oil on paper. And basically there are a lot of painting works on paper that I've done that involve removing paint from the canvas and then working back, putting them on the floor, walking on them, and, you know, things of that nature. And it's not, I was surprised when Helene selected this and the others, but they really are very, very fine drawings, I think. This painting from '99 called Sunrise Ruby, 82 by 75, also oil and linen. It's hard to say too much about this painting. It's like a burst of sun. Unusual for me. I don't use yellow very often. It's a pale yellow, but the way it intersects with things, it has a kind of luminosity to the. It's another painting I was kind of stunned by when I saw it at the museum, because the Neuberger Museum has an extraordinary, the scale of the rooms, the height of the ceilings, the light was perfect. And it was revealing to me to see how rich the surface of this painting is, and the color, and it is involved with the grid, even though it's not a literal grid. Most of my work pays attention to an internal grid. This is another drawing. This one was done on corrugated cardboard. And it is 30 by 38 acrylic. By the way, there are thousands and thousands of drawings that have never been seen. And Helene started looking through my flat files, and she said, oh. And she said, you must have Susan Harris over to look at these, you need a retrospective. So, anyway, there are lots of them. This is a very small piece of sculpture that is in the ICA show in Philadelphia. It's 1 1/4 by 8 1/2. It's made on rusted metal, oil paint on rusted metal. I'm sorry there aren't installation shots of that show because it's so interesting and curious. In addition to 5 major paintings on the walls, they're paintings that are this big, literally 2 inches by 3 inches, that go around what was constructed as an architectural gallery within the gallery. So there are these little paintings and then these little sculptures on a platform, and paintings on carpet samples and odds and ends that she came across. This is this is also a slide from my studio, so ergo the arrow. The experience that Ingrid and I had in Venice during the residency, 2 residencies that we had, was a very powerful one. I mean, when I was there, we had an apartment right near the Rialto Bridge, and I just worked on paper and did a lot of photographs. And normally when I come back from not working in my studio, it takes me forever to get started. And I thought, oh, it's going to be a long haul before I can really get going. I walked into my studio and boom, I had a whole series of paintings that all had to do with Venice. And it was like it had come through my hands from the water in the canals. This is called, and it was there's a funny story. Well, this is Serenissima. It is 70 by 88, oil on linen. And it's very much about that kind of rising feeling in the paintings, in all the cathedrals and the scuolas. And this is called Margate, courtesy of Ingrid, who figured out what this painting was. We had been in London to do this show of the watercolors from Venice, and while we were there, there was a late Turner show, and a Constable show, and a late Rembrandt show, and my paintings, and they were all painted in Venice, and I didn't realize that until I began to think. The Turners were painted in Venice, the Constables were painted in Venice, and I was painting in Venice, and so there was an instant connection that I felt, and I came back and I made this painting. I thought, what is this? It didn't make sense to me about any other painting that I had done. Ingrid walked in and she said, Margate. And it suddenly occurred to me that this was a ship in a storm. my ship in a storm. It is, did I say this is 72 by 88, oil on linen, 2015. And last but not least, a painting called Chrysleriana, 57 by 56, also from 2015. A surprising painting for the kind of color that is here, particularly the yellow and the red and the pale blue. And I was, again, stunned by the palette. And Chrysler, I listen to a lot of music when I'm in my studio, and I was listening to a lot of Schumann. I love the piano. I played the piano. I have a piano teacher who's a genius, who does concertizes all over the world. And so I thought, this is Chrysleriana, which is a major piece of Schumann's piano repertoire. And but it was so unusual. You can't really see the surface. It's very manipulated. It's a lot of knife work, broad. I use tools that are workman tools, plasters, knives. I actually used a brush once that was done to put tar on roofs, things like that, so that there is still remains that connection to sculpture, as well as my 100% commitment to making paintings. Thank you.
Well, there's certainly time for questions. So are there questions about the amazing, fabulous work that we just experienced? Randy.
Hi, Louise, in the early period where you were trying to move towards a singular voice of your own, how do you sustain as an artist that search period?
How did I
times where you just wanted to say, I don't know where I'm going?
Well, it was a very rich moment because even though I was balancing on a high wire in a way, and the women that I was involved with in the women's group, the politics that was going on, there were meetings and weekends and all these crises and fighting and infighting. I had a kind of privacy because I wasn't involved with other artists at the time. I was on my own. I worked in an apartment on the Upper West Side, and many pieces, unfortunately, are missing in action. But I think that what happened in this women's group, finally, I realized that that there was a strength in me, and I just had to investigate it. I had to look at it. And, you know, I was always struggling with, you know, how can I be a woman in making art? I mean, I remember sitting in Herman Gundersheimer's art history class at Tyler and looking at the paintings. He was a great, great teacher. And thinking, I'm a fake. How can I consider myself an artist when there are no women in this field? Who am I? You know? And so, you know, having that experience and balancing the way I did, I developed tremendous strength, I have to say. And in retrospect, I really made a very strong person here in order to do that work. And it wasn't easy. It was not easy, because I'd relied on the rectangle. But the work was so revealing. I felt connected to others in a way that I hadn't before. Even if it wasn't a tradition of painting or fine art, it was like, you know, learning how to tie knots. It was like suddenly I was a craftsperson. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but
Perfect.
Such a pleasure and privilege to hear you speak and about your process, about your story, about everything. I particularly enjoyed hearing about your experience as a woman from the time you started, and wanted to know if you had any advice today for women who were trying to rise and emerge in a still male-dominated market where galleries represent mainly men, the gallery I work for, and I speak to so many number of female artists who would just be thrilled to hear you speak like you did today. Just curious if you have any advice that I can pass on as inspiration to all of these younger women I constantly try to encourage.
well, you know, many years ago, I was on the lesbian collective of Heresies magazine, and I wrote 2 pieces. One was called the Tapes, which was I came up with a bunch of questions for the women who were older and the younger women to compare their experience as lesbians and making art. And Amy Silman was in the group, Sue Friedrich was a filmmaker, Betsy Kroll, my partner, Sarah Whitworth, who I met originally as the registrar at the Whitney under Marcia Tucker. And so I did this interview. That was one large tape of all of these women speaking to their experience, various questions that I had posed. And the second piece I made, thank you, Ingrid, for pointing it out, was called How I Do It. And it was revealed to me in a lecture that was given at the Neuberger by, remember his name?
Richard Meyer.
Richard Meyer. There were 4 people who were giving papers on my work, which was like, what? But he talked, he was going to talk about the 70s, my work during the 70s, and I thought, what is he going to do? You know, what kind of, and what he did is he brought out these 2 papers, and particularly How I Do It, and he read from this. Now, I was kind of embarrassed by that piece, always, and I never went back to reread it. Well, it's very, very good, and it's like, for women, like, here's how to do this. Now, I have to say, as an addendum, that it's been a struggle for me till this very moment, being a woman, and you know, I've been told that if I had been a man, my career would have taken a very different route. But given that, I've done very well, and I'm very happy. I have a happy life. I mean, it's difficult, but it's a good life. And I think that was a very important document that I wrote, despite my confusion about it. How I Do It in the Heresies, lesbian heresies. It wasn't about lesbians, it was just about artists.
You can get it online.
There's another question over here.
Yeah, first of all, I think this is a great event. The questions I think your answer to the last question practically is so climactic. For me, the work has always been, the key word was that rising feeling that you said, I think, almost unconsciously. It's kinetic, it's spiritual, and it's cultural. You're not coming from front. You're not coming from the discourse. You're coming from deep inside. But I think, another great, just, if this is being recorded,
It is.
show this. The other thing about my take on the feminism thing is the tremendous generosity.
The tremendous.
Generosity at the core of feminism. That's what I felt. You should see.
Well, my choice, since my education as an artist was the teachers didn't share too much about how you make paintings, how you live as an artist. There was no information. And so what I decided during the time that I was involved with the movement and after that when I was beginning to teach is that I really taught, I tried to teach the women in the class how to make art. And from my experience and my struggle, here's what you have to do. And I would ask a question, like I taught at Columbia for a while, long time ago. And I'd ask a question and the men would go like this. and I would stop and I would say, very, very nice questions, very nice comments, but where are the women in the group? I mean, this is what's happened for centuries. I'm only taking questions from women. And there's like, and there was a quiet because the women didn't know, at that time, they didn't know how to frame a question to me. I mean, I'm sure there were, if Eva Hess had been there, she would have framed a question.
The boldness, I mean, the tools, the sculpture, the engagement, the kinetic. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Something should happen when you look at a painting.
I agree.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much. I've got to say that the first time I saw Louise's work at Chime and Read, I did have a complete blown over wow moment. So it was very physical for me as well as, emotive, etc. So it was definitely an experience. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to also introduce my colleagues who are normally on the screen here. Penny Pilkington from PPOW, Alyssa Friedman from Salon 94, Donna Harkavy. I'm not sure where you had mentioned earlier, and where you're, thank you, and Gracie Manchin from ArtNet. My name is Joy Glidden, and I'm with Art Index TV, which is a television show that aired on PBS and just got picked up by Canopy. It's in all the universities, and this is our day today. So have a fabulous rest of the day, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.